In a nation that has in the past month vigorously rebelled against the racism that has produced videotapes of two black men being brutally killed in the street and another man being threatened with the apparatus of the state by white people who themselves were in the wrong, it is time for the people of compassion to step up to this moment and push the nation to address and redeem its 400-year history of racial subjugation. In a progressive movement that has and will again be purposely manipulated so that members of it will regard each other as sellouts and enemies instead of people with whom they have manageable disagreements, it is time for the people of transformative compassion to step up to the moment and show that Americans can demonstrate deep respect for people we deeply disagree with. In a world where a pandemic that is killing people, particularly those of color, devastating livelihoods and threatening futures, but is one of many global problems that argue for having more rather than fewer voices determining our future, it is time for the people of transformative compassion to step up to the moment and proclaim that all voices count so we can expand the table of decision making. Anyone who thinks of themselves as a white ally or an anti-racist activist is by definition a person of transformative compassion. That identity says that I want to be a force for increasing the amount of compassion in the world. This is a big task. I'm looking to connect with people who are willing to work on themselves so they can do their part in this depressing moment to turn it into a moment of transformation to a more compassionate world. What I want to talk about today are the special powers, maybe even the superpowers, that anti-racism allies potentially have if they have to do the work of transforming this nation. What I want to talk about today is how anti-racist allies might use those special powers that they have to step up to the call of allyship that is in this moment today. Before we go any further, I want to make some process adjustments and suggestions. When it comes to screen fatigue, as the young folks say, the struggle is real. So if you want to reposition yourself, relax in your chair or on a couch, that's fine. Part of screen fatigue is because the artificial and imperfect nature of this type of communication wears on our brain. There'll be very few slides in this presentation, so if you want to just listen, that's fine. I just ask that you don't multitask, especially with your phone or other devices. And of course, if you're at your computer, feel free to make comments in the chat. We'll read them all. The events of the past few weeks, the Central Park Coopers, the death of George Floyd, and the knees and bystander indifference of the police, and the response to that all around the country, the release of the videotape shooting of Ahmaud Arbery, all are stark and disturbing reminders that should make it clear to anyone that America has an ongoing problem with racism. All across America, people are registering their upset at one or more of these despicable events that we've all witnessed. I even saw Sean Hannity express his disturbance at the George Floyd killing in the street. It's easy to feel disgust and anger for such vile actions that violate our social contract. But if we're to play a role in moving this nation forward, we must ask, what is the energy and spirit that we bring to people in our circle who've not violated the social contract with vile acts, but who have views that we think are vile? If we're to be people of transformative compassion, we have to ask, what is the level of compassion that we should bring to people whose views we detest and that we think undermine compassion? We all know that these highly publicized cases of racism are prominent outgrowths of something that simmers barely beneath the surface of our culture. I would invite you to slightly shift how we think about the problems of everyday racism so that we can see the extreme racism that sometimes comes out as connected to the everyday problems that we see. I would invite you to think about all of this as a problem of white folks not having sufficient compassion for people of color. Vocabulary.com says that compassion is putting yourself in someone else's shoes and really feeling for them. So for a moment, I want to suggest that we think of this as a compassion problem. The reason I want to encourage a reframe of the problem of racism as a compassion problem is because I think there's another problem that you and I care about that is also a compassion problem. It's often not talked about in those terms, though. I'm going to get to this other compassion problem in just a minute, but I want to provide some evidence for seeing racism as a compassion problem. Now, the problem of white folks not having enough compassion for people of color is not limited to these horrible examples of people being killed in the street. There's good evidence that there's a much broader problem of compassion within the white population. So I'm going to give you a few illustrations looking at public opinion polls. So for each one, I'm going to ask a question about white public opinion, and I ask you to think for yourself, what's the percentage of white folks who believe this? I'm going to pause for a second, and then I'm going to tell you the answer. If your hands are on the computer, you can put your answer in the comments. Now, let's remember, any scholar of public opinion will tell you that the past decades have seen substantial improvements in racial attitudes as measured by public opinion polls. I'll give you an example. In the mid-50s, 90% of whites opposed interracial marriage. That number now is down to about 10%. Okay, so let's remember there's been a lot of progress. Okay, a lot of that progress, I want to ask the question. What's the percentage of whites who are willing to tell an anonymous surveyor that they think blacks are less evolved than whites? The answer is 38%. In 2016, what was the percentage of whites who think that blacks are less industrious than whites? The answer, 32%. So just to be clear, as disturbing as this figure is, in 1990, it was 60%. So good job, white people, for moving forward. That's a lot of progress in 30 years. Okay, last question. Looking at the entire nation, including the populous blue states and the less populous red states, what's the percentage of whites who think that racism against whites is just as important of a national problem as racism against people of color? The answer is 55%. By the way, the goal of the White Ally Toolkit is to move the number of whites who don't think racism against people of color is a real problem. It's more important than racism against whites. The goal is to move that number from 55% to 45% by 2025. And just to be clear, for the sake of this talk, we call that 55% includes racism deniers, racism minimizers. We call all of those people racism skeptics because we're trying to use a term that they would find respectful if they heard it. Clearly, it is going to be difficult to make progress on racial equity issues when a significant plurality of white folks essentially think that black people are inferior, and a majority don't think that racism against people of color is a problem worthy of specific attention. So I want to turn now to another problem that you and I care about, that I think is usually framed as a problem of the lack of white compassion. Now, I'm not sure that the origins of this other problem are related to race exactly, but I am certain that the solutions to each of these problems are the same. And the solution to these problems lies with you and people like you. Let me get right to the point. I think that white conservatives and white progressives have a lack of compassion for each other. And this lack of compassion shows up in America's problem of extreme political polarization. Let me give you a few statistics about polarization just to further make the point. 81% of Americans are disturbed by the level of political polarization, so everybody thinks this is a problem. But let's drill down and look at what the polarization looks like. 52% of Republicans say the Democrats are more close-minded than other Americans. 70% of Democrats say Republicans are more close-minded. 70% of Democrats and 62% of Republicans are afraid of the other party. Not just disagreement, but afraid of them. 43% of Americans say they have acted uncivilly. 50% of both Republicans and Democrats say they have ended a friendship or a relationship with someone because they were uncivil. 27% and 31% of Republicans and Democrats, respectively, say it would be harder to get along with a new person in their community if they were of the other party. That is going to make having a democracy really difficult. One more stat. In 1958, 34% of Republicans and Democrats wanted their daughter to marry someone of the same party. That was important to them. By 2016, that was 61%. So people are so identified with their political tribe, they don't want the folks in the other political tribe in their families or even in their neighborhoods. So given these statistics, I think you can see why I'm thinking that there's a compassion problem between white progressives and white conservatives. Now, let us not forget that this tribalism is purposely being stoked by Vladimir Putin, who pays an army of people a whole lot of money to help Americans more deeply loathe each other. And of course, let's remember, President Trump loves divisions too. Having people despise each other fires up his base. He wants you to hate him and his followers. So remember, when you think of Trump's people as deplorables, and when you treat them that way, the terrorists win. Now, I'll give you some statistics. Let me just tell you what I have personally seen. I have spent more and more time over the years as a coach to help white people talk to each other. And it is increasingly clear that this polarization that I just was referring to, a political polarization, is actually affecting how families function. Talking about the big issues in our society has always been a little bit dicey, but it seems that in the past several years, things have shifted in the negative direction. Whether the subject is race, whether it's abortion, whether it's gun control, whether it's President Trump, and on down the list, white folks have lost the ability to talk to each other even in their own family. A vibrant democracy thrives on discourse. So this trend is not what we need. This is undermining democracy. I am continually amazed at the way that white people seem incapable of tolerating the fact that people they're connected to by blood, by organization, by church, by past friendships, they sometimes have vastly different views than themselves. Now, to a much greater extent than happens with black people, this is a non-white group I'm most familiar with, white folks appear to have a shockingly low ability to see people who they have difference of opinions with as people they want to stay connected to. For example, people have said to me, if I learned that my neighbor was a Trump supporter, I don't think I'd let them into my house. These are the people who look after your house when you go on vacation. Even more shocking to me is what feels like a willingness of white people to throw each other away over politics. And this includes family members. A woman once told me she decided she was not going to talk to her cousin until Trump was out of office. What are you talking about? I wanted to stand on a table and scream and ask, what is wrong with y'all? These are people in your family. These are people that you grew up with. These are people you have cried together at funerals with. Are you really going to let some politician make it impossible for you to have a civil conversation? So, if there was more time, we go further into this. If there was more time, we could talk about this willingness of white folks to throw each other away. We could ask if this was a weakness in white culture, if this was a reflection of culturally ingrained privilege. If we had more time, We can explore whether or not the reason that people of color are less willing to discard relatives is because they've learned over the centuries that families are interdependent systems of support where everybody matters. And you don't throw people away because they think about the society differently than you. If we had more time, we might find creative ways to talk about what happens, what appears to be a cultural weakness that white folks have. I was talking to a white friend of mine about this, and he said that white men like himself need a pill for EDD, empathy deficit disorder. Now, he also said that white women need that pill sometimes too. But we don't have time for that. So other things I want to get to in the time we have. And this has to do with how this lack of compassion problem affects our politics. Most political science efforts say that between 8 and 20% of Trump supporters are what might be called persuadable, meaning they're leaning towards Trump but are not committed to voting for him. So we have to ask ourselves the question, in the current climate we have, how do we reach persuadable people? I want to make the case that white progressives are the key to this election. I have a book on this, and I'll tell you about it before we close. White progressives are stepping up to this moment. That's vital to the election, and it's vital to make progress on issues around the historic denial of racism. That is what I really want you to take away from all of this. It is vital that white progressives step up to this moment by getting past their disinclination to talk to people that they disagree with. So, why do I think white allies are critical? Well, to understand it, one of the things we have to do is step back and look at the fact that American social life is incredibly racially segregated. A few years ago, the Washington Post did a poll to find out how segregated people's friendship networks were. Look at the portion of friends of people who were in the same racial group as themselves. Latinos had friendship groups that were on average 61% Latino. Blacks, 81% black. Whites were the most segregated. On average, their friendship networks were 91% white. So our friendship networks are pretty segregated. Now, let's do a breakdown of Trump's support. Blacks, 8% voted for Trump. Asians, 26% voted for Trump. Latinos, 27% voted for Trump. Whites, 58% voted for Trump. So if there's going to be any interpersonal influence wielded on Trump persuadables, it's likely to be within the same race groups. Now, I know that some of y'all out there have segregated your conservative-minded friends out of your networks. Still, most progressive-minded white people I know have conservative folks in their network. Polling data bears this out. A 2016 poll found that for the typical Obama voter, more than 10% of their close friends were Romney voters. So there's a certain amount of cross-ideological mixing that happens in our friendship groups. But, as I mentioned, progressives are not talking to the conservative people in their circles. Or if they're talking to them, they're doing so in boorish, condescending, and obnoxious ways. Maybe in response to what they've gotten, but they're still doing that. And these ways of interacting only play into Trump's narrative about how liberals look down on conservatives. An important challenge for white progressives is to step up to having more and better conversation in informal settings between white people about substantive issues, race, politics, the pandemic, whatever. These white folks are in your family. They're your neighbors. They're your friends. They're your fellow parishioners. They're your co-workers. My hope is that people who want to call themselves allies can expand their activity from posting on Facebook and do the hard work of using transformative compassion as the basis of talking in your circles to people about issues of race, racism, politics, etc. So, white folks are split in half about Trump and about racism, as I said before. But interestingly, white folks are the least likely to want to have this conversation. This is not just my intuition. A couple years ago, Pew did a study about people's feeling about talking to people who disagree with them, especially disagreed about the president. They asked people if they found these conversations to be stressful and frustrating versus informative and stimulating. Now, overall, 59% of the people found these kind of conversations stressful and frustrating. But there's a lot of variation by group. Conservative people, overwhelmingly white, they, at the level of 52%, found the conversations stressful and frustrating. Black liberals, 56% found it stressful and frustrating. Latino liberals, 61% found it stressful and frustrating. White liberals, 74% found these conversations stressful and frustrating. So, what does this mean? This means white liberals who have the most access to white conservatives, much more than people of color, but they are the very people who are the least inclined to have this conversation. That's not good for the progressive movement, and that's not good for making progress on racism. It is white progressive people who need to be talking to people across the divide so they can reach the Trump persuadables. My message is that my message is that white progressives have a special power to move the needle. And it is time for people to step up and do it. Whether it's about the election, whether it's about racism, we need white progressive people to step up to this moment and do the conversational work necessary. But in order to do that, you're going to have to make some changes in both your thinking and in your behavior. Now, what has to happen? What are these changes that we need to make so that white progressives can be the agents of transformative compassion that our society needs? Well, there are some specific dysfunctions in the white progressive mind that people got to get beyond. First is the racist, non-racist binary. And this is a pervasive train of thought in the white community. Basically, it says that people are either completely racist and evil, or they're completely non-racist and good. Now, in conservative circles, this often looks like the only way to be racist and evil is to consciously disparage and use bad words against groups. If you don't do that, you are fine. Looks a little different on the left, where being a non-racist is less about what you don't say, more about what you do say, particularly in regard to using latest terminology and concepts about systems of oppression. If you don't use the right terms, I'm afraid I got to tell you that you're a racist. Well, that's one problem. But even a bigger problem on the left is the woker than thou culture that we have. Right now, we have a culture among white people on the left where any sign or history of any racially problematic thoughts or behaviors are evidence that you are not woke, that you are a bad person. This is the collective left-wing version of the racist, not racist binary. There's a pattern on that social justice warrior left that gives no grace at all to anyone who has or has ever had a racially problematic thought or might have said something. It is important that people show they have been woke since the Clinton administration. We have to get past that culture. I think it produces something that might be called performative wokeness, where people try to impress each other with how much they know or the linguistic skill with which they can demonstrate that somebody else is not as woke as they think they are. The biggest problem with this culture is that it reinforces the idea that people need to look at those as less woke than themselves with contempt. And contempt is very counterproductive to doing the soul surgery that we need to do with each other to create change. Martin Luther King said, you have very little morally persuasive power with people who can feel your underlying contempt. Now, there's some good news. The good news is that there are some methods that can turn things around. So there are some findings from brain science that can help us foster persuasion across difference if we know how to use them. So one of them is something called mirror neurons, which is the way our brains work to mimic the states of people that we feel identified with. There's another phenomenon, well researched, about the impact of empathy. And the research finding is that the best way to get people to listen to you is to listen to them first. And of course, there's always the power of story. And there's the finding that stories are more persuasive than facts when you're trying to persuade people. Now, how can you bring all of these together? Well, that's what I've been working on. So over the past few years, I've used my superpower of thinking about dialogue to develop a simple but robust system for managing conversations that work with what we know about brain science to help people become more persuasive and talk across those divides. The system is called the RACE method of managing a conversation, and it's based on two principles. Basically, when you're trying to persuade someone of something, you got to do two things. One, you want to shift the conversation from beliefs and facts and towards mutual storytelling. Second principle, ABC, alignment before challenges. You want to spend time in the conversation creating a sense of alignment with something the other person already believes before you try to get them to adapt your new ideas. These two principles guide the RACE method. RACE stands for reflect, ask, connect, expand. Each step represents a phase in your exchange, which may last one conversation or may last over several conversations. But the method gives you a map, which helps you make and execute a plan. Now, this method of managing conversation is simple to explain, but it is not easy to do because doing it requires you make some big changes in how you approach conversations. Let me just briefly run down what the phases are. Reflect means calm down. That's vital. Tap into your underlying compassion and remember that you want to approach this conversation through storytelling. Ask. You want to ask as many questions as it takes to get the other person to tell you a personal story about an experience related to the belief you disagree with. Connect. Tell a personal story that allows you and them to feel some level of alignment between you. And you do all of that before expand, where you tell them another personal story designed to invite them to different thinking about whatever the topic is. Again, this process is easy to describe but hard to do, and it's especially hard when you have been trained and trained yourself to look at the person with different views as not worthy of respect or not worthy of compassion. It's hard to do, but it is not impossible to do. Now, what does it take to utilize this method? What are the potentials, the powers that people need to develop to take advantage of the best practices in persuasion? One of the things that is a special power that white folks have, there are several, I want to focus on two. One of them is the power of modeling. Now, one of the things that a white person can do that a person of color simply cannot do is to show people a model of being a white person grappling with racial issues. Only white folks can do that. So even though I cannot personally demonstrate for you a white person owning up to their connection to racism, I can offer some modeling of someone owning up to being affected by racially problematic thoughts. So several months ago, I was in Minneapolis. I had some extra time and decided to do some walking. As you may know, in the downtown area, there are a lot of skywalks and sky bridges connecting the buildings so that people can walk around downtown during the very cold winter. At the time, I was trying to get in my 10,000 steps a day, so I was walking around kind of randomly. So I'm walking down one of the skyways, and I made the unusual sighting of a black person black person. He might have been a guy in his 20s or 30s, shorter than me. He's coming my direction. So I tried to wait for the right time so I could sort of make eye contact with him and perhaps do the kind of that black person nod thing. Like some of y'all might know that this is a kind of silent, subtle thing that a lot of black people do with each other when they're in overwhelmingly white spaces. So at that time, he kind of cut his eyes at me, and I couldn't really tell whether he was acknowledging me or not. So I just was kind of looking at him, and as he went by, I noticed that he had a backpack that looked completely empty. I remember, that's kind of odd. Who walks around with an empty backpack? Also noticed he had that look of being somebody from like Somalia or Ethiopia. And you know, there was a strong immigrant population in Minneapolis of those folks. Well, a couple of skywalks later, I think I made a turn. I'm not really sure. I somehow glanced back, and I noticed the guy's walking in the same direction as me. I said, that's interesting, since he was going in the opposite direction before. But, you know, I'm from Detroit, from the crimey 70s, and so, you know, sometimes my sense of radar can be a little bit more tuned up than necessary. So I kept going, and at some corner, I noticed, I think I made a turn. At some point, I noticed this dude's still behind me. So at that point, I got a little extra nervous. So I'm like, what's this guy doing behind me? Is he up to something? When he looked at me, did he see me as a mark? Why is somebody walking around with what appears to be a completely empty backpack? So I told myself, okay, stop tripping. I want to refocus on just getting my steps. So then I walk a little further. I make some sort of random turn. I don't know. I'm not going in a particular direction. And after I make the turn, at mid-block, I look back, and this dude is still behind me. Now, I would not say that I panicked, but I decided to take some evasive action. So I stopped. I pretended to check my phone. I'm checking my phone, so I keep my eye on him, see, make sure he goes by. When he goes by, he doesn't acknowledge me, and so I breathe a little easier, but I'm still kind of watching him. So before I even get to the third breath, he turns into a little hole-in-the-wall establishment that was a shoe and luggage repair place. It looked like he had like a big greeting with the guy who ran the place, who also looked like he was a Somalian, maybe related, who knows. Anyway, they greet each other warmly, and then the guy who had been stalking me takes his backpack off, and they started talking about it, and it was clear he had brought it there for a repair. So I kind of laughed at my nervousness and thought about this. Here I am doing evasive maneuvers to get Mr. 5'10", 160-pound Somalian terrorist to slip. So I had to even tell myself, come on, man, what's up with that? So, but then I had to ask myself, how much of that nervousness would I have felt and what I've gone through had the guy been like a young white guy? I think it would have been highly unlikely that I would have been going through all that fear, walking around essentially in a mall in broad daylight. So at one level, my cowering and nervousness from like being all tripping out by this skinny guy is really ridiculous. It's kind of funny in a certain way. In another way, though, my thoughts are kind of troubling. On the basis of how this guy looked, I went from seeing a normal guy doing a very normal thing to some highly unlikely worst case scenario, and I had a reaction to that. What I did to him is what people have done to me when they lock their car doors as I walk through the mall parking lot in broad daylight. It's also what happens that caused resumes from somebody named Aisha to get fewer callbacks than those with somebody named Molly. This glitch in thought is called unconscious bias, and it's at the root of a lot of modern racism. Sometimes the consequences are deadly. That glitch in thinking at the level of thought is the same reaction that happened in the minds of the McMichael men who killed Ahmaud Arbery in Georgia. It's the same reaction, it's the same thought was in the minds of George Zimmerman who killed Trayvon Martin in Florida. It's the same thought in the minds of Timothy Loman who killed 12-year-old Tamar Rice in Cleveland. Clearly my actions are different than those people who took those people's lives, but my thoughts were, in an important way, no different than theirs. I want y'all to notice what I did. I admitted in a public forum that I an official black person, am subject to racist thoughts. I'm not proud of that, but I told y'all anyway. Now by doing that, I'm hoping to model for you that such admissions are okay. Good people, even wokish black people, are subject to the societal infection of racism. My hope is that by doing that, it makes it just a little easier for you to make a similar admission, even just to yourself, that you sometimes have similar thoughts. I want you to notice something else. When I first told the story, both the tone and my ending to the story put it in a "oh silly me" context. It makes it kind of humorous, light, relatable, and non-judgmental. But then I gave another context to the same story, and I connected it to the heinous crimes that we know about in the Ahmaud Arbery case. In that case, we've actually seen it, and I connected it to other heinous crimes we know about. Now, had I told the story differently originally and had a more serious ending, you might have even more powerfully seen the link between my behavior and those egregious events. The race method that I teach prepares you to skillfully use your own stories to educate people about racism. For the people of transformative compassion, the call of allyship today is to learn how to mine your own experiences and your own point of view to find tools that will help you have conversations that are honest, connecting, and that represent you doing your part to dismantle racism. Now, the last potential that white folks have to change our situation might be the most important. This potential is something so important and so specific to white progressives that we might call it a potential white ally superpower. However, it is sorely undeveloped. The goal of this project is to create a space for anti-racism allies to learn how to develop the superpower in service of them more consistently responding to the call of transformative compassion that is embodied in today's call for greater allyship. This concerns the ability to stay centered and focused during these kind of conversations. Now, let's remember, when people of color have conversations about racism, people sometimes reconnect with the devastation to their own people and their families. It's easy to do that. For some people, it's not hard to get sad, to get angry, or to become disgusted. Part of the reason that white progressives are in the best position to engage others about historical and current racism is precisely because they are not victims of it. Because allies see racism as about dismantling a system that for the most part benefits themselves. Their perspective is received by racism skeptics with an entirely different level of credibility. They're not going to be perceived as self-interested as they advocate for change. But this is only half of it, and not even the biggest half, of the benefit of not being from a historically disadvantaged group, a group victimized by racism. There's an additional benefit that is vital that white allies learn how to leverage. When white people should be hurt or even get mad about racism, and that's perfectly fine. But I think it's one thing to be mad at a social system because it's wrong, and quite a different thing to be mad at centuries of racist victimization because it has a direct impact on you, your ancestors, and the people you love. But there's really another point about getting mad that I have to say. I want white folks to be mad about societal racism. If you want to be mad at Trump, at your governor, at the heads of institutions, you go ahead. It all should make us mad. That passion might be productive, but it is not productive for you to get mad at your racist Aunt Molly or your coworker Dylan. Your getting mad at them is not helping me. We need white folks to learn how to remain calm and gin up their compassion when they engage people who are demonstrating a lack of compassion for people of color. This is your critical value added. This is your leverage. This might be your superpower. What this project is about is creating a space so you can be a force for doing the healing work that is so needed in America and in your own families. The hope of the project is that white folks will come to see that a racism, skeptic, problematic remark is not something that creates a pit in your stomach as you strategize how to make the moment go away, but rather those remarks are an opportunity for you to do some of the important healing work that only you can do. Now, this may sound a little strange given the anxiety that many of you feel at the prospect of talking about race. That's all right. I'm inviting you, as a person of transformative compassion, to look at the situation differently than you have. I am asking you, in fact, to use your privilege, specifically the privilege of not being a multi-generational victim of racism. Because when white folks talk to someone who denies the reality of racism, there are some things that don't affect you. When you talk to white folks about racism, you don't have to worry about controlling an overwhelming rage at American racism that completely confined the life, hopes, and dreams of your great-great-grandparents who were enslaved. When you talk to folks about racism, you don't have to think about a grandfather, Barry Campt, who was returning home from church and got in some sort of verbal spat with a white man and was killed for no apparent reason. The crime appears to have never been investigated by the police. You don't have to worry about thinking about that. When you talk to white folks about racism, you don't have to think about being overcome by thinking about your grandparents, Elsie and Creola Wiley, who had to leave school after the 3rd and 4th grade, respectively, to begin lifetimes of cleaning white folks' schools or their houses. When you talk to folks about racism, you don't have to worry about being overcome. Think about your father's ambition to be an engineer, which was thwarted because companies simply just weren't hiring black folks with engineering degrees at the time. When you talk to folks about racism, you have to worry about your own experience of having your legitimacy questioned, being told rental housing was unavailable 30 minutes after being invited over to see it, or being called nigger walking down the street. For a white person of transformative compassion to step up to the moment of allyship, you don't have to wrestle about being overcome with any of that. And what's great about stepping up to this moment of allyship is that when you do this work on the other person, you also are doing some important work on yourself. Doing the work on a racism skeptic who hides a certain level of contempt for other people in their heart requires you pushing past the contempt that you, in your heart, you have for them. In trying to reach the racism skeptic and tell them that the racist, non-racist binary is counterproductive and tends to blind them to racist problematic things that they have done, you remind yourself of your own blindness. When you try to teach a racism skeptic that we must simultaneously hold ourselves accountable for the way that their benign words or thoughts are connected to the racism we all decry, and simultaneously give themselves some grace for being a flawed vessel in a very flawed system, you remind yourself of the need to extend loving accountability to you. A person of transformative compassion, to step up to the current moment of allyship, means flipping a virtuous cycle into a vicious cycle into a virtuous cycle. Right now, the vicious cycle goes like this. White folks don't have compassion for people, for me and other people of color, and allies are mad about it. There's nothing wrong to be mad about it, but again, it is not helpful to bring that anger to cousin Clive, your sister Hannah. So you bring the opposite of compassion to them, you bring that anger, and when you do that, not only do you soften their heart towards me, they harden themselves toward you. Your contempt breeds their contempt that they direct toward me and you. This project is about shifting that. We need you to bring compassion to them and do so smartly. So not only do you move toward greater compassion, but they move to greater compassion towards you, but also towards me. So in closing, I want to restate my belief that white folks mindful of transformative compassion can step up to this moment of allyship and do something new. Now, just to be clear, I get a fair amount of feedback from other folks of color that I have too much faith in the white ally community and that I should not believe these people can step forward. People ask me for the evidence that investing in allies is a good use of time and effort. My response about why I believe in y'all is partially in the face of conflicting evidence. But I simply choose to believe in the potential of white folks to step forward and step into this moment. But I also believe it because I know there have been white allies in the past who stepped up to these moments in the past. So, when you think about whether you want to step up to the current moment, you need some inspiration, there are people you can think about. There are people who sacrificed a lot. There was Vermin Dahmer, killed in 1966, when the Klan set his house on fire to crush his efforts to help black people vote in Mississippi. He and his family were in it. You can think about Viola Liuzzo, who traveled from Detroit to Selma, Alabama, to respond to the call of Dr. King to come help after Bloody Sunday. She died in a hail of bullets shot into her car while shelling people to and from the airport. You can think about James Reed, a minister who traveled from Washington, D.C. to Selma to help Dr. King with the voting rights movement there, beaten and left for dead on the streets by white men with clubs. There were activists who joined black protesters at lunch conference sit-ins where they were spat upon, threatened by spontaneously forming crowds upset because they're violating the social order. In all of these cases, white folks stepped up to the current moment. They stepped into being allies, and they used their very presence, which was a superpower. You have the potential and even the superpowers that you can develop. Just like the martyrs I mentioned, you don't have an obligation to step up to that moment. They had a choice whether or not they wanted to engage. You have a choice too. Now, I certainly do hope you prepare yourself to step up to these moments. As you think about it, I'd ask you to remember that the call to allyship today is not asking you to put your life on the line like it was in the past. Today's call to allyship is not asking you to survive your house getting burned down. It's not asking you to survive, to combat gangs of men on the street with clubs. It's not asking you to evade Klansmen bent on murder. It's not even asking you to endure being verbally demeaned by a mob. What's being requested of you is that you take seriously your special power to do your part in some long overdue surgery on the American soul. It is time for the people of transformative compassion to step up and get to work. Now, to support folks stepping up to this current moment of allyship, we offer a variety of resources, all available on the Dialogue Company website, which is www.thedialoguecompany.com. There's our flagship book called the White Ally Toolkit Workbook. It gives you guidance on how to deal with a variety of racially problematic statements. There's also a section of the book that helps you if you don't want to wait till somebody says something racist, but instead have decided that your allyship is going to involve you working with somebody over a period of time. Because people will learn better in groups, we created a discussion group leaders guide so that groups of people can facilitate their own groups and process through the workbook. But there's more. We've also had books that focus on providing step-by-step guidance to learning the race method. The Compassionate Warrior Boot Camp and Equipping Anti-Racism Allies are based on the same step-by-step plan. The Equipping Anti-Racism Allies book adds some spiritual content to the process because we have realized this is spiritual work. But there's more. All the books I mentioned are focused on helping allies have conversations about race with people who don't think racism is real. Again, 55% of the white American public. Most of these folks like the conservatives, but not all. We know that all racism minimizers are not conservatives and that all allies are not progressive. Our latest book basically adapts the same methods of persuasion and helps people apply them in the realm of politics with a specific focus on the current presidential election. This book is called Connection Transforms Contempt and is available now. All of the books are available on Amazon. But to be honest, you can support the project a lot more if you're willing to download the PDF from us. As y'all know, Jeff Bezos is doing just fine these days. Y'all know he's on track to become the first trillionaire because of all the money made in the pandemic. So we don't mind if you buy from Amazon, but of course we prefer you buy the books from our website. I want to make sure you know about a special opportunity to engage this content. On June 4th, we're starting a new cohort. The e-course is called Doing My Part to Dismantle Racism. Introduction to White Ally Toolkit. The course meets on Thursday nights from 8 to 9:30. We meet every 2 weeks for 4 sessions. The meetings are group coaching sessions, but the course is a blended learning environment that's mounted on a learning platform. We're interested in you learning these methods and then practicing them so you can make them a part of your intentional communication. So the real work, of course, is between the session. You can learn more about the course on the Dialogue Company website. But, so please check it out. So listen, I want to thank you so much for your time. We're in a really important and perilous moment in our country, and everybody has to pull their own weight as we try to rebuild from the last 4 years and from the effects of the pandemic over the last 4 months. So anything I want to leave you with is that I think white progressives have a very important and unique role to play in the healing of this nation. My hope is that each of you find a way to step up to this moment. The nation needs people of transformative compassion to step up. Thank you for your allyship.